Hello there, your instructor for this session is Mr. Mahmoud Saber. I hope you enjoy your time with me. Today we are going to start a David Copperfield Chapter 3 summary. 2 months passed since David went to Salem House. As we knew before that Mr. Murdstone sent him to a boarding school to get rid of him. In this chapter, 2 months passed since he went to Salem House. This is the name of the school. On his birthday, we mean here David, Mr. Creakle's wife told David that his mom died. Mrs. Creakle packed David's clothes, and that means that he will never go back to school again. And the Murdstones, we mean here Mr. Murdstone and Mrs. Murdstone, his sister, asked Peggotty, the servant, to leave the house, and they said that they don't need her anymore in their house. She suggested taking David with her for a holiday, and the Murdstones agreed. Peggotty told David that his mom was ill and she got worse after the baby was born. She was telling David here the way his mother died. On the last night, she asked Peggotty, Clara asked Peggotty for some water and gave a patient smile and died like an innocent child going to sleep. Barkis whispered again to David when taking him and Peggotty to your mouse one more time. He whispered again to David, Barkis is willing. David and Peggotty arrived in Yarmouth. When he met Emily again, she seemed different than before. David told them about Steve Force, his friend at Salem House, the school, and Peggotty decided to marry Barkis. David was ashamed when he was sent to work in a warehouse. As we know that Murdstone wanted to get rid of David, so he sent him to a factory or a warehouse to work in London. David returned to Blunderstone. The Murdstone considered school too expensive, though, so as we said before, they found a job for David in a warehouse. David's job was to wash the bottles in the factory, and he was paid 6 shillings a week. David felt horror, ashamed and afraid, and he knew that he was the only one who went to school in that warehouse. Mr. Micawber, this is someone who works at the same place with David. He offered David a spare room in his house because Mr. Murdstone asked the manager of the factory to find David a place to stay in London. He wanted to get rid of him completely, so he asked the manager to let David stay in London. So Mr. Micawber was the one who hosted David in his house. The Micawbers were very poor. Although Mr. Micawber and his wife, Mrs. Micawber, were very poor, they invited David to stay with them in their house. Mrs. Micawber told David that her husband is in debt. The Micawbers didn't know how to manage money, and Mr. Micawber spends money all the time and spends a lot, and he asked for money from many people, so he is now in debt, and he risked going to prison. Mrs. Micawber's character was similar to her husband's. David lived on bread and cheese only while working in the warehouse. Mr. Micawber was arrested for his debts. David visited him in prison and spent a pleasant evening telling stories and jokes together. David told Mrs. Micawber that her husband was going to be set free, and they celebrated together. Mr. Micawber decided to leave London and go to Devon. He wanted to start a new life there. David found out that it's time to leave the warehouse too, and he decided to go to find his aunt. David decided to find his father's aunt and ask her for help. Now it's time for exercise. What did Mrs. Creakle tell David about his mother? She told him that his mother died. Number 2. Why did Mrs. Creakle pack David's case? Because he will leave the school and never come back again. What did the Murdstones decide to do with Peggotty after David's mother's death? They asked her to leave the house because they don't need her anymore. Who was Peggotty going to marry? Mr. Barkis. And how did the Murdstones get rid of David? They sent him to the warehouse to work. How much did they pay David? He was paid 6 shillings a week. Now it's time for quotations. Number 1. We will have to accept that our loved ones die at any moment. These words were said by Mrs. Creakle to David when his mother died. Number 2. She put her head on my arm and died like an innocent child. These words were said by Peggotty to David when his mother died. Barkis is willing. You told her that? These words were said by Barkis to David to tell it to Peggotty. As we know before, Barkis wanted to marry Peggotty, so he asked David to tell her, saying Barkis is willing. I love you just as much, my dear, when I'm married. These words were said by Peggotty to David after she had left the house and married Mr. Barkis. I never thought when I lived with mother and father before I was married that I would ever be as poor as this. These words were said by Mrs. Micawber to David when she was telling him about her life with Mr. Micawber and how miserable she feels. I hope my mistakes will be a warning to young people like you. These words were said by Mr. Micawber to David when David visited him in the prison. I hope you enjoyed your time with me. It was Mr. Mahmoud Saber. If you have any inquiries related to the session, just send me and I'll respond as soon as possible. Thank you.